The photograph slipped from the leather wallet and landed face up on the diner floor. A small hand reached for it. 6-year-old fingers traced the faded edges, the worn corners soft from years of touching. Madison froze. The woman in the picture was smiling. Young, beautiful, familiar. Too familiar. She looked up. The man in the $1,000 suit had stopped breathing. His coffee cup hung suspended halfway to his lips. His eyes blue, sharp, now wide with something like terror locked onto the photograph in her hands. Then he saw her face. Really saw it. Behind the counter, a coffee pot shattered against tile. Brown liquid spread across the floor like a dark omen. Jennifer stood motionless. Shards of glass at her feet, her waitress apron splattered, her face drained of all color. 3 strangers. 1 photograph. 7 years of silence. Madison's voice cut through the frozen air. Mommy, why does this man have your picture? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. Jennifer moved first. Her legs carried her forward before her mind caught up. Glass crunched beneath her sneakers. She stumbled over a chair leg, caught herself on a table edge, kept moving. Her eyes never left the photograph in her daughter's hands. David stood abruptly. His chair crashed backward, metal screaming against tile. Every head in the diner turned. Forks stopped midair. Conversations died. Jennifer reached Madison and snatched the photograph away. Her hands trembled as she stared at her own face, younger, happier, stupidly hopeful. A ghost from another lifetime. She looked up at David. He opened his mouth to speak. Her palm connected with his cheek before the first word formed. The crack echoed through the silent diner. A woman gasped. Someone's phone camera clicked. David didn't flinch, didn't step back. He stood there, absorbing the blow. A red mark blooming across his jaw like a confession. Madison burst into tears. Mommy, what's happening? Jennifer grabbed her daughter's wrist. She yanked off her apron and threw it onto the counter. Tips scattered. She didn't care. 6 years of working double shifts, of smiling through exhaustion, of pretending everything was fine, none of it mattered now. We're leaving. Jennifer, please. She was already moving, pulling Madison toward the exit. The bell above the door chimed cheerfully, obscenely out of place. She didn't look back. Couldn't. David stood frozen among the wreckage overturned chair, scattered coins, shattered glass, stunned witnesses. The photograph hung limply in his fingers. One corner was torn. The edges were soft, almost fabric-like from years of handling. He ran. The parking lot swallowed him in afternoon heat. Jennifer's Honda rusted. Dented, held together by prayers roared to life. Tires squealed. The car lurched backward, then forward, then disappeared down the highway in a cloud of dust. David watched until there was nothing left to watch. His Bentley sat 3 spaces away. Black, gleaming, obscenely expensive. A monument to everything he'd chosen instead of her. He pressed the photograph against his chest like a wound. His phone vibrated. Then again. He pulled it from his pocket with numb fingers. The screen glowed in the harsh sunlight, displaying a name that made his blood run cold. Father. Calling now. Right now. As if the old man already knew exactly what his son had just found. The apartment stairs groaned under Jennifer's feet. 3rd floor, no elevator. The hallway light flickered twice, then surrendered to darkness. She climbed the last steps by memory, Madison's hand gripping hers. Inside. She locked the door, then the deadbolt, then the chain. Madison stood in the middle of their cramped living room. Tears dried to salt tracks on her cheeks. Mommy, who was that man? Jennifer walked past her to the kitchen. She opened the refrigerator, half a carton of milk, 2 eggs, a package of pasta she'd been stretching for 3 days. Mommy, she filled a pot with water, set it on the stove, turned the burner to high. Why did he have your picture? The pasta went into the boiling water. She stirred it slowly, watching the dry strands soften and curl. Is he a bad man? Jennifer divided the pasta onto 2 plates. She gave Madison the fuller portion and kept the smaller one for herself. They ate in silence at the wobbly kitchen table, the one she'd found on the curb last spring and repainted herself. Madison fell asleep at 8:30, exhausted from crying. Jennifer tucked the thin blanket around her daughter's shoulders and stood in the doorway, watching the small chest rise and fall. She looked like him, the shape of her jaw, the color of her eyes, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking. 7 years of pretending otherwise. 7 years of lies. Jennifer closed the bedroom door softly and returned to the kitchen. She pulled a shoebox from beneath her bed, the one she never opened, the one she should have thrown away long ago. Inside 3 photographs, a dried flower, brown and crumbling, a letter she'd written but never sent, and a plane ticket to New York, dated 4 years ago. She held the ticket between her fingers. The memory surfaced before she could stop it. Madison had been 2. Jennifer had scraped together enough money for a bus ticket, convinced herself she was doing the right thing. She'd stood outside his building in Manhattan, a glass tower that touched the clouds, holding her daughter against her hip. She never went inside. A newsstand on the corner displayed his face. David Harrison, golden boy of tech, smiling beside a woman in a red dress. The magazine headlines screamed about power couples and billion-dollar futures. Jennifer bought a return ticket that same hour. She never told anyone about that trip. Not her father, not her friends. She buried it like a shameful secret, another wound she couldn't afford to examine. Now she sat alone in her kitchen, staring at that useless plane ticket, wondering if anything would have been different. Across town, David sat in his Bentley outside Jennifer's apartment building. The lights in her window went dark at 11. He stayed anyway, engine off, watching nothing. His phone showed 7 missed calls from father. He hadn't answered a single one. The photograph was back in his wallet, pressed against his chest, where his heart refused to slow down. He remembered the night he left. 24 years old. Standing outside her dorm room at 3 in the morning. He'd written a letter explaining everything: his father's ultimatum, the inheritance, the threats. Choose the money or choose the girl. He'd torn that letter into pieces. He told himself he'd come back, that he'd build something on his own, prove he didn't need his father's empire, and return to her free and clear. 7 years. 7 years of telling himself tomorrow. 7 years of carrying her photograph like a penance he couldn't put down. And now a daughter he never knew existed. He pressed his forehead against the steering wheel and stayed there until dawn, 40 miles outside town. Robert Thompson wiped engine grease from his hands with a rag that had seen better decades. 67 years old. Widower for 15. owner of a repair shop that barely broke even, father to a daughter who'd inherited her mother's stubbornness and his own inability to ask for help. He'd closed up for the night when his phone rang. Jennifer's voice came through shaky and thin. She told him everything: the diner, the photograph, the man in the expensive suit who'd reappeared like a ghost she thought she'd buried. Robert listened without interrupting. His knuckles whitened around the phone. He remembered his own trip to New York 7 years ago. He'd found David in a parking garage, walking toward some flashy car that cost more than Robert's house. He'd grabbed the boy by his collar and thrown him against the concrete pillar. David hadn't fought back, hadn't called security, just stood there and took it, blow after blow, until Robert's fists were too tired to continue. "Don't come back," Robert had said, breathing hard. "You're not worthy of my daughter." David had nodded and vanished. Robert never told Jennifer about that night. He'd convinced himself he was protecting her. Now, listening to her cry over the phone, he wondered if he'd only made everything worse. "Daddy," Jennifer said, her voice cracking, "did you know anything about why David disappeared?" The question hung in the air between them. Robert looked at his hands, scarred, calloused, stained with decades of honest work. Hands that had held his baby girl, hands that had beaten a young man until he bled. He should tell her. He knew that. The secret had festered long enough. "Sweetheart," he said slowly, "there's something I've been hiding from you. For 7 years, David didn't leave." 3 days after the diner, he rented a small house 2 blocks from Jennifer's apartment. Nothing fancy: peeling paint, creaky porch, a lawn that hadn't seen care in years. He paid 3 months up front in cash and moved in with a single suitcase. Each morning, he parked across the street from Madison's elementary school. He never got out of the car, never approached the building, just sat there, watching children stream through the front doors, searching for one small face among the crowd. On the 4th day, Madison spotted him through the classroom window. She waved. David's breath caught. He raised his hand slowly, uncertainly, like a man who'd forgotten how the gesture worked. Her teacher appeared beside her, frowning at the strange man in the parked car. Madison said something. The teacher's frown deepened, but Madison just smiled and waved again before disappearing from view. That afternoon, Robert Thompson's phone rang. The school had questions. A man had been watching the premises. Should they call the police, Robert said he'd handle it. He found David the next morning at the repair shop. The fool was already there. Standing at the broken fence Robert had been meaning to fix for 2 years. David had a hammer in one hand, nails in the other, and absolutely no idea what he was doing. "What do you think you're doing?" David looked up. His suit was gone, replaced by jeans and a plain white shirt already stained with rust. "Fixing your fence." "I didn't ask you to fix anything." "I know." Robert studied the younger man. The expensive watch was gone. So was the arrogance he remembered from 7 years ago. What remained was something raw or desperate. Maybe hungry. "You can work," Robert said finally. "No pay. You owe me that much." David nodded and returned to the fence. Jennifer arrived at noon to bring her father lunch. She stopped dead when she saw David on his knees in the dirt, hammering a crooked nail into a crooked board. What is he doing here? Robert took the sandwich from her hands. Working. You can't be serious. I want to see what he's made of. Robert bit into the sandwich. The boy who runs away and the man who stays, they're not the same person. Let's find out which one he is. Jennifer opened her mouth to argue, but Robert had already turned away. Day 7 brought the first crack in the wall. Madison slipped out of the apartment while Jennifer was showering. She walked the 6 blocks to her grandfather's shop alone, following a route she'd memorized from car windows. David was under a Chevy, only his legs visible. Madison crouched down and peered into the darkness. "What are you doing under there?" He startled so violently, he banged his head on the chassis. When he slid out, his face was smeared with grease and something that might have been tears. "You shouldn't be here alone. I wanted to see you." Madison sat cross-legged on the concrete, unconcerned with dirt. "You have my mommy's picture. That means you know her, right?" David wiped his face with his sleeve, making it worse. "I knew her. A long time ago." "Were you friends?" The question was so innocent, it nearly broke him. "Yes. We were friends." Madison nodded seriously. "I don't have a daddy. You know, Mommy says he's very busy. Too busy to visit." She picked at a loose thread on her shorts. "I want a purple bicycle for my birthday. But Mommy says we have to wait." "We always have to wait." David looked at this child, his child, though she didn't know it, and felt something shift in his chest. Something that had been frozen for 7 years. "Purple's a good color," he managed. Madison smiled. It was Jennifer's smile on a smaller face, and it nearly undid him completely. By day 10, Jennifer made a decision. "You can see her," she told David. "Supervised, 1 hour." They went to the park. Madison ran between them like a pinball, dragging them towards swings, slides, the rusty merry-go-round. David pushed her on the swing, higher, higher, until her laughter filled the empty afternoon. Jennifer watched from the bench. She noticed things. The way David checked the swing chains before letting Madison sit. The way he panicked when she jumped off mid-swing, rushing to catch her, though she landed perfectly fine. The way he listened when she talked. Really listened. Like every word mattered. He wasn't the boy who left. She wasn't sure who he was now. Day 12. David borrowed an old bicycle from a neighbor. He spent 3 hours teaching Madison to balance, running alongside her, catching her when she wobbled. She fell, scraped her knee, cried for 30 seconds. David looked more traumatized than she did. Jennifer stood at her window, watching them circle the parking lot below. And for the first time in years, she smiled. That night, a text arrived. "Give me a chance to start over." She stared at the screen for a long time. Her thumb hovered over the block button. She set the phone down instead. Day 13 began like any other. David arrived at the shop early, ready for another day of fence posts and oil changes and proving himself. Then the limousine appeared, black, gleaming, longer than Robert's entire storefront. It stopped directly in front of the shop. The engine died for a moment. Nothing moved. Then the rear door opened. Harrison Sr. emerged slowly, 73 years old, silver cane in hand, eyes like chips of winter ice. He wore a suit that cost more than the shop's monthly revenue. He surveyed the dusty lot, the rusted cars, the peeling paint, with an expression of profound distaste. His gaze found David. Son. The word carried no warmth. It's time you knew why I'm really here. Harrison Sr. walked through the repair shop like a king surveying conquered territory. His cane tapped against the concrete floor, each strike precise and deliberate. David didn't move. What are you doing here? Saving you from yourself, as always. The old man produced a thick manila envelope from inside his jacket. Sit down. I'll stand. Harrison Sr. shrugged and dropped the envelope onto Robert's workbench. Open it. David hesitated. Every instinct screamed warning. But his hands moved anyway, pulling back the flap, sliding out the stack of papers inside. Bank statements, dozens of them, transaction records spanning 6 years, monthly transfers of $3,000, sometimes more. All routed through something called the Tennessee Family Assistance Foundation. David looked up. What is this? Exactly what it appears to be. Harrison Sr. leaned against a rusted car hood, unconcerned about his suit. I've been supporting your little waitress since the child was 6 months old. The words didn't make sense. David stared at the papers, then at his father, then at the papers again. You knew. Of course I knew. Harrison Sr. examined his fingernails with theatrical boredom. I had investigators following her within a week of your departure. Imagine my surprise when they reported a pregnancy. David's hands began to shake. The papers rattled. You knew about Madison? For 6 years. 6 years, 3 months, and 14 days, to be precise. And you never told me. Harrison Sr. finally looked at his son. His eyes held no apology. No shame, only the cold calculation David had learned to fear as a child. I wanted to see what you would do. Whether you'd find your way back on your own, whether you had any spine at all. He smiled thinly. You failed the test, David. 7 years, and you never once came looking. David's vision blurred. His father had known. All those nights he'd stared at Jennifer's photograph, wondering where she was, whether she was happy his father had known. He could have found her in an hour. A phone call, an address. Instead, the old man had watched, waited, tested. You sent money, David said slowly. Why? The child is my blood. I may be many things, but I don't abandon family. Harrison Sr. gestured at the papers. Jennifer believes it's a government assistance program. She has no idea the funds come from our accounts. A harmless deception. David's fist connected with the car beside him. Metal dented. His knuckles split open. Blood dripped onto the floor, and he didn't care. You stole 7 years from me. You stole them from yourself. Harrison Sr. was unmoved by the outburst. I merely refrained from fixing your mistake. There's a difference. David grabbed his father's lapels with bloody hands. The old man didn't flinch. Give me one reason I shouldn't. Because I'm not finished. Harrison Sr. reached into his jacket again. Another envelope. Thinner this time. This is why I'm really here. He pressed it into David's chest. David released his father and tore open the envelope. Medical records, charts, lab results. Madison's name was printed at the top of every page. Congenital heart defect, Harrison Sr. said quietly. Diagnosed when she was 4. Jennifer knows she's been saving for surgery for 3 years now. At her current rate, she'll have enough money, approximately never. David flipped through the pages. Understanding may be 1 word in 10. But he understood enough. Surgical intervention required. Timeline critical. Estimated cost $500,000. The condition is worsening faster than expected. Harrison Surter took back the medical file. The doctors give her 3 months, perhaps less. David couldn't breathe. His daughter was dying. There's more. Harrison Sr. produced a final document. The surgery requires a tissue match, a specific compatibility that's rather rare. Jennifer isn't a match. The National Registry has no viable donors. He handed the paper to David. You are the only compatible donor in the family. Possibly the only compatible donor within 1,000 miles. David read the words 3 times before they registered. Cardiac tissue compatibility. 97% match. Recommended donor. He was the only one who could save her. So, here's what's going to happen. Harrison Sr. straightened his jacket. You'll undergo the procedure. You'll save the child. And then you'll return to New York and resume your responsibilities. And if I want to stay, you won't. The old man produced a check from his breast pocket. $50 million, already signed. Complete the surgery. Sign away your parental rights, and take this. Disappear from their lives the same way you did 7 years ago. Clean. Simple. David stared at the check. More money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. His father was buying him off. Again. You want me to save my daughter and then abandon her? I want you to be realistic. Harrison Sr. pocketed the check. You're not father material, David. You never have been. The kindest thing you can do for that child is give her your tissue and then get out of her life before you inevitably disappoint her. David opened his mouth to respond. The shop door creaked open. Jennifer stood in the entrance, face pale as bone. Robert was behind her, equally stricken. They'd heard everything. 6 years. Jennifer's voice was barely a whisper. 6 years of assistance checks. From you, Harrison Sr. inclined his head. You're welcome. You knew David was Madison's father. You knew she was sick. Jennifer stepped forward, hands clenched at her sides. You've been watching us like specimens in a jar. I've been protecting my investment. Your investment. Jennifer laughed a broken, terrible sound. She's not an investment. She's a child. My child. Our grandchild. Harrison Sr. corrected. Which is the only reason she's still breathing. Jennifer turned to David. Her eyes held 7 years of betrayal. 7 years of struggling alone. 7 years of lies she was only now beginning to understand. You're a donor match. David nodded. And you knew before today? No. His voice cracked. I swear. Jennifer, I didn't know any of this. Not about the money. Not about Madison being sick. Not about... I don't believe you. She stepped back, shaking her head. I don't believe either of you. I'm done with this family. She turned and ran. David tried to follow, but Robert blocked his path. Let her go, son. She needs time. But Madison, we'll be fine. Jennifer's a good mother. The best. But Jennifer wasn't heading home. She was running toward the school, toward her daughter, toward the only thing in her life that still made sense. She found Madison on the playground, sitting alone on the swings. The teacher approached with concern. Madison had complained of chest pain during recess. They'd called Jennifer 3 times, but she hadn't answered. Jennifer scooped her daughter into her arms. Madison's face was pale. Too pale. Her small hand pressed against her chest. Mommy, she whispered. It hurts to breathe. And then she went limp. The ambulance sirens split the afternoon in two. Jennifer held Madison against her chest, pressing her daughter's limp body so tightly she could feel the faint, irregular heartbeat through both their shirts. The paramedics shouted words she couldn't process. Oxygen mask, blood pressure dropping, cardiac event. The ambulance doors slammed shut. The vehicle lurched forward. Jennifer gripped Madison's hand and didn't let go. At the hospital, everything became a blur of white coats and fluorescent lights. They wheeled Madison through double doors marked "Emergency No Entry." A nurse physically restrained Jennifer from following. "Ma'am, you have to wait here." "That's my daughter. The doctors need room to work. Please." The doors swung closed. Jennifer stood in the empty hallway, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the small rectangular window that showed nothing but more hallway beyond. She was alone. The waiting room had 12 plastic chairs, a vending machine with a cracked screen, and a television mounted too high on the wall. Playing news no one was watching. Jennifer sat in the chair closest to the emergency doors. She pulled her knees to her chest and pressed her forehead against them. Images flashed through her mind. Uncontrollable, relentless. Madison, at 11 months, saying "Mama" for the first time, the way her whole face had scrunched up with the effort, then broken into a gummy smile of triumph. Madison, at 3, refusing to wear anything but her yellow rain boots for an entire month. Even to bed, even in summer. Madison, at 5. Asking why other kids had daddies at the school play, Jennifer had smiled and said, "Daddy's very busy, sweetheart. But he loves you." The lie had tasted like ash in her mouth. Madison this morning, eating cereal at their wobbly kitchen table, humming a song she'd learned at school, normal, healthy, alive. Jennifer's phone buzzed. "Robert." She answered with numb fingers. "I'm coming," her father said. 20 minutes. She couldn't respond. The words wouldn't form. Jenny, talk to me." She collapsed. Her voice sounded foreign, like someone else was speaking. She was on the swing and she stopped. "I'm coming. Hold on." The line went dead. Jennifer lowered the phone and stared at the emergency doors. 30 minutes passed. An hour. 90 minutes. Robert arrived first, bursting through the waiting room entrance with grease still on his hands. He sat beside Jennifer and wrapped his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him like a child, the way she hadn't done since her mother's funeral 15 years ago. "She's strong," Robert said. "She's your daughter. She's strong." Jennifer nodded against his chest. But the words meant nothing. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. The emergency doors opened at the 2-hour mark. Dr. Mitchell emerged, pulling off blue surgical gloves. His face was arranged in the careful neutrality of someone trained to deliver terrible news. Jennifer stood so fast, she knocked over her chair. "She's stable?" Dr. Mitchell said quickly. "For now." "For now." 2 words that contained a universe of fear. The cardiac event was more severe than we anticipated. Her condition has deteriorated significantly since her last checkup. Dr. Mitchell consulted his clipboard, though Jennifer suspected he already knew every word by heart. "We previously estimated she had 3 months before surgery became critical, based on today's episode. I'm revising that timeline." Jennifer's fingernails dug into her palms. How long? 2 weeks, perhaps less. The floor tilted. Robert caught her before she fell. The surgery itself is complex but achievable. Dr. Mitchell continued. The main obstacle is the tissue match requirement. We need a compatible donor, and the National Registry hasn't found any candidates. There's a match. The words came from behind them. David stood at the waiting room entrance. His shirt was untucked. His hair was wild. He looked like he'd run the entire distance from the repair shop. I'm a match, he said. I'll do the surgery, whatever she needs. Jennifer spun around. No. Jennifer. I said no. She stepped toward him, and even Robert couldn't hold her back. I don't want your help. I don't want anything from your family. Your father's been manipulating us for 6 years, and I didn't know. David's voice cracked. I swear to you, I didn't know any of it. Not the money, not her illness, nothing. And I'm supposed to believe that. Jennifer laughed bitterly. The billionaire who couldn't be bothered to send a single letter in 7 years suddenly appears. And it's all just coincidence. I was a coward. David's hands hung at his sides, open and empty. I was 24 and terrified and weak. And I made the worst decision of my life. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to let me save our daughter. Our daughter. The words hung in the air between them. Jennifer's resolve wavered for a fraction of a second. Then she remembered the magazine cover in New York. The power couple headline. The red dress. She's not your daughter. Jennifer's voice was ice. You lost that right when you walked away. She turned back to Dr. Mitchell. There must be other donors. Somewhere. The doctor shook his head slowly. The compatibility requirements are extremely specific. Mr. Harrison is, frankly, a miracle. The odds of finding another match in time. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Jennifer pressed her hands against her face. Her shoulders shook, but no sound came out. 7 years of holding everything together, and now the walls were finally crumbling. Robert stepped forward and put himself between Jennifer and David. Give her space, he said quietly. She needs time. David nodded, but he didn't leave. He walked to the far end of the waiting room and sat in the plastic chair closest to the wall. He folded his hands in his lap and stared at the floor. And he waited. The night stretched endlessly. Jennifer sat beside Madison's bed, holding her daughter's small hand through the tangle of IV lines and monitoring wires. The heart monitor beeped in a steady rhythm too slow. The nurse said, but stable. Madison's face was pale against the white pillow. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. She looked smaller than 6. Fragile in a way Jennifer had never allowed herself to notice before. Robert stood at the window, watching the parking lot below. He could see David's silhouette in the waiting room, motionless in the same chair. Hour after hour. 7 years ago. Robert had found David in a New York parking garage. He'd grabbed the boy by his collar and thrown him against a concrete pillar. He'd punched him until his own knuckles split open, until David's face was a mess of blood and forming bruises. David hadn't raised a hand to defend himself. Not once. Don't come back. Robert had snarled. You're not worthy of my daughter. David had nodded, spat blood onto the pavement, and walked away. Robert had told himself he was protecting Jennifer, that David was poison, that she was better off without him. He'd carried that conviction like armor for 7 years. Now, watching David keep his silent vigil in the fluorescent-lit waiting room, Robert wondered if he'd been wrong. Not about all of it, but maybe about some. Dawn crept through the hospital windows at 6 in the morning. Gray light filled Madison's room, washing the color from everything. Madison's eyelids fluttered. "Mommy." Jennifer leaned forward instantly. "I'm here, baby." "I'm right here." Madison turned her head slowly, wincing at some internal pain. Her eyes drifted past her mother, past her grandfather, to the window that overlooked the waiting room. Through the glass, David sat exactly where he'd been all night, unmoving, unsleeping. A statue made of guilt and desperate hope. Madison's voice was barely a whisper, but every word was clear. "Mommy, that man out there, he's my daddy, isn't he?" Jennifer couldn't answer. She stared at her daughter, this impossibly perceptive child who had somehow understood what adults had spent years hiding. Madison's eyes, blue like David's, waited patiently for a truth that was 7 years overdue. "Yes," Jennifer whispered. "He's your daddy." Madison nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd already known. Then she closed her eyes and drifted back to sleep, her small hand still wrapped around her mother's fingers. Robert found David in the waiting room at 7 that morning. The younger man looked destroyed, unshaven, red-eyed. His expensive shirt was wrinkled beyond repair, and he smelled like someone who'd been sitting in the same plastic chair for 12 hours. Robert lowered himself into the adjacent seat. His knees protested audibly. For a long moment, neither spoke. "My wife died 15 years ago," Robert said finally. "A cancer took her in 8 months, start to finish." David looked up but said nothing. "She was the strong one. I was just the fool who got lucky enough to marry her." Robert stared at the vending machine across the room. "Before she passed, she told me something. Said it over and over, like she knew I'd need to hear it 1,000 times before it stuck." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. Old, creased, handled so many times the edges had gone soft. She said, "A man who makes mistakes isn't lost. A man who won't fix them is..." Robert unfolded the paper and handed it to David. It was a drawing. Crayon on construction paper. The colors faded with age. 3 figures stood in front of a lopsided house, a woman with yellow hair, a small girl in a purple dress, and a man. The man had no face. Madison drew this when she was 4. Robert said, asked her why the daddy had no face. She said it was because she didn't know what he looked like. Said she left it blank so she could fill it in later, when she finally met him. David's hands trembled around the paper. A tear fell onto the crayon house, darkening the roof. "I hated you for 7 years," Robert continued. "Convinced myself Jennifer was better off without you. Maybe I was right. Maybe I was protecting my daughter." He paused. Or maybe I was just an angry old man who couldn't see past his own fists. David finally spoke, his voice raw. "You had every right to hate me. Maybe. But that little girl in there..." Robert nodded toward Madison's room. "She doesn't hate you. She's been waiting her whole life for you to show up. And now you're here, and she's dying. And the only question that matters is what you're going to do about it." David looked at the faceless man in the drawing. Then he stood. "I need to make some calls." He walked outside into the morning sun, phone already pressed to his ear. The first call went to his company's board of directors. David spoke for 4 minutes, his voice steady and cold. He was resigning as CEO. Effective immediately, no. He would not reconsider. No, he did not care about the stock price. Transfer his responsibilities to the COO and remove his name from the letterhead. The second call went to his financial advisor. Sell 40% of his holdings. Liquidate everything non-essential. Yes. He understood the tax implications. Yes. He was certain. The third call went to his lawyer. Establish a charitable foundation for children with heart conditions. Fund it with half of everything he just liquidated. Name it after Madison. When he walked back inside, his father was waiting. Harrison Sr. stood in the hospital lobby like a man accustomed to owning every room he entered. His silver cane clicked against the tile as he approached. "I heard about your little tantrum," the old man said. "Resigning, selling your shares, have you completely lost your mind?" "Probably. The company will collapse without you. Everything I built, everything you built was never mine." David met his father's eyes without flinching. "I'm done being your puppet. I'm done choosing money over people. And I'm done letting you control my life." Harrison Sr.'s face hardened. "If you do this surgery and stay here, I'll cut you off entirely. No inheritance, no trust fund. Nothing." "Good. You'll have nothing. I'll have my daughter." David stepped closer. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel small next to his father. "That's more than you've ever had." He turned and walked away. Harrison Sr. stood alone in the lobby, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. The next 3 days blurred together. David slept in the waiting room. He learned the names of every nurse on the cardiac ward. He memorized Madison's medication schedule, her vital signs, the meaning of every beep from her monitors. Jennifer watched from a distance. She saw him fetch coffee for exhausted nurses without being asked. She saw him read children's books to Madison through the glass, his voice muffled but steady. She saw him call contractors about wheelchair ramps and accessible bathrooms for a house he was apparently renovating nearby. He wasn't performing. There was no audience to impress. He simply worked, hour after hour, like a man trying to compress years of absence into days. On the second night, she found him studying medical journals in the waiting room. Cardiac surgery, tissue donation, recovery protocols. The pages were covered in highlighted passages and handwritten notes. On the third night, he fell asleep sitting up, head tilted back against the wall, a stuffed purple elephant clutched in his hands, a gift he'd bought for Madison, but hadn't yet found the courage to deliver. Jennifer stood in the doorway and watched him sleep. The anger was still there. 7 years of it. Calcified into something hard and permanent. But beneath it, something else stirred. Something she wasn't ready to name. She walked to the vending machine, bought a coffee, and set it on the table beside him. Then she returned to Madison's room without looking back. David woke at dawn to find the coffee cold beside him. He stared at it for a long moment, understanding what it meant. Not forgiveness? Not yet. But maybe the first step toward it. Day 5. Derberge Vierhofrat. Mitchell appeared in the waiting room, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Harrison, I need to speak with you privately." David followed him to a small consultation room at the end of the hall. The doctor closed the door and gestured to a chair. "The surgery is scheduled for 48 hours from now. Before we proceed, there's something you need to understand." Dr. Mitchell opened a folder and spread several documents across the desk. The procedure to harvest the tissue you'll be donating, it's not without risk. David's stomach tightened. What kind of risk? The location we need to access is complicated. The doctor removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. There's a 15% chance of serious complications. Nerve damage. Partial paralysis. In extreme cases. He paused. I need you to understand what you're agreeing to before you sign these consent forms. David didn't hesitate. Where do I sign, Dr. Mitchell studied him for a long moment. Mr. Harrison, I need you to fully understand. I understand. David pulled the consent forms toward him. 15% chance of serious complications, possible nerve damage, possible paralysis, possible death. He uncapped the pen. My daughter has a 100% chance of dying without this surgery. The math isn't complicated. He signed every page without reading the fine print. That night, David sat alone in the hospital chapel. He wasn't religious, hadn't been inside a church since his mother's funeral 20 years ago. But the silence felt necessary. Sacred, even. He pulled out a notepad and began to write. The first letter was for Madison. He wrote about the day she was born, even though he hadn't been there. He wrote about the photograph he'd carried for 7 years, how her mother's face had been his North Star through every empty night. He wrote about the purple bicycle he'd already ordered, waiting in a warehouse for a little girl who deserved every dream she'd ever had. He wrote, I'm sorry I wasn't there for your first steps, your first words, your first day of school. But I promise you this, I will be there for everything else, every birthday, every scraped knee, every nightmare, every triumph. If I survive tomorrow, I will spend the rest of my life earning the right to be called your father. The second letter was for Jennifer. This one took longer. The words came harder, weighted with 7 years of silence and regret. He wrote about the night he left, the ultimatum from his father, the letter he'd written and destroyed. He wrote about every morning he'd woken up reaching for her, every night he'd fallen asleep holding her photograph like a prayer. He wrote, I was a coward. I chose money over love, security over you. I told myself I'd come back when I was strong enough to stand on my own. But the truth is, I was never strong. I was just afraid. Afraid of my father. Afraid of failing you. Afraid of being the man you deserved. If I don't wake up tomorrow, I need you to know leaving you was the worst mistake of my life. Not a day passed when I didn't think of you. Not a single day. I love you. I never stopped. He sealed both letters and found Robert in the waiting room. If something goes wrong tomorrow, David said, pressing the envelopes into the older man's weathered hands, give these to them and tell them. His voice broke. Tell them I finally stopped running. Robert looked at the letters, then at David. For a moment, the old mechanic's eyes glistened. You're not going to die, son? It was the second time Robert had called him that. David nodded, not trusting his voice. Then he walked to Madison's room for what might be his last visit. She was awake. The machines beeped steadily around her, painting green lines across black screens. Her face was pale, but her eyes, those impossible blue eyes, were bright and alert. Hey, David said softly, settling into the chair beside her bed. Hey. Madison's voice was small but steady. Grandpa says you're going to help fix my heart tomorrow. That's the plan. Does it hurt what they're going to do to you? David considered lying, decided against it. Maybe a little. But you know what? When I think about you getting better, running around, riding that purple bicycle, it doesn't seem so bad. Madison was quiet for a moment. Then she reached out and took his hand. I'm glad you came back, she whispered. Even if it took a really long time. David's throat closed completely. He squeezed her fingers and said nothing, because nothing he could say would be enough. The morning of the surgery arrived gray and cold. David was prepped first. Hospital gown, IV lines, the antiseptic smell that would forever remind him of this day. Jennifer appeared in his doorway. She looked exhausted. Dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. The most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. I still haven't forgiven you, she said. I know. I don't know if I ever will. I know that too. She stepped closer, then closer still, until she was standing beside his gurney, looking down at him with an expression he couldn't read. But you're about to let them cut you open to save our daughter. And her voice wavered. I don't know what to do with that. David reached for her hand. She let him take it. You don't have to do anything, he said. Just be there when Madison wakes up. Tell her I kept my promise. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. She squeezed his hand once, hard, then released it and stepped back. Don't you dare die. David Harrison. Yes, ma'am. The orderlies wheeled both gurneys toward the operating room. Madison on one, David on the other. They traveled side by side down the long white corridor, monitors beeping in syncopated rhythm. At the doors to the surgical suite, Jennifer caught up to them. She kissed Madison's forehead, then turned to David. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she leaned down and pressed her lips to his forehead. Soft. Brief. A benediction. Come back to us, she whispered. The doors swung open. The gurneys separated David to one operating room, Madison to another. The last thing he saw before the anesthesia claimed him was the ceiling lights blurring into a single white sun. 8 hours. Jennifer sat in the waiting room, surrounded by cold coffee and crumpled tissues. Robert paced by the window. The clock on the wall ticked with agonizing slowness. Hour 2. A nurse emerged with an update. Both patients stable. Proceeding as planned. Hour 4. Another update. Minor complication with David's procedure. Resolved. Continuing. Hour 6. Jennifer's hands wouldn't stop shaking. Robert finally sat down beside her, his own face gray with exhaustion. Hour 7. The surgical team had completed Madison's portion. She was in recovery, stable, alive, no word yet on David. At hour 8, Mitchell finally emerged. He was still wearing his surgical cap. His scrubs were sweat-stained. He looked like a man who just fought a war. Jennifer stood so fast the room spun. Madison is doing beautifully, Dr. Mitchell said. The tissue integration was successful. Barring complications, she should make a full recovery. Jennifer's knees buckled. Robert caught her. And David, Dr. Mitchell removed his cap and rubbed his forehead. There were difficulties. The nerve cluster we needed to navigate was more involved than the scan suggested. What does that mean? It means we had to make some choices. difficult ones. The doctor paused. He's alive. He's stable. But we won't know the full extent of any damage until he wakes up. If he wakes up. The words hung unspoken in the air. Jennifer sank into a chair. Her body felt hollow, emptied of everything except fear. A commotion near the entrance made everyone turn. Harrison Sr. walked through the waiting room doors, alone. No cane. His shoulders, usually rigid with authority, seemed somehow diminished. He approached Jennifer with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. Shame. From his coat, he withdrew a wooden box, old, polished, the kind of thing that held family heirlooms. "These belong to you," he said, placing it in her lap. Jennifer opened the lid. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to her, in David's handwriting. Postmarked over 7 years, one every month like clockwork. "He wrote to you constantly," Harrison Sr. said, his voice barely audible. "Every letter I intercepted. Every attempt to contact you, I blocked." The old man's hands trembled at his sides. "I told myself I was protecting the family legacy, protecting him from weakness." He looked toward the operating room doors. "I was protecting nothing. I was destroying everything." Jennifer stared at the letters. 7 years of words she'd never received. 7 years of love she'd never known existed. "My son is in that room because he chose you over everything I ever offered him," Harrison Sr. continued. "He chose that little girl over wealth, over power, over his own safety. And his voice cracked. "I spent his whole life teaching him that love was weakness. But he proved me wrong." The old man lowered himself into a chair, aging decades in seconds. "I came to ask your forgiveness, not for his sake, for mine." He looked at Jennifer with eyes that had finally learned to weep. "And to meet my granddaughter, if you'll allow it." Before Jennifer could respond, a nurse burst through the recovery room doors. "He's awake," she announced. "Mr. Harrison is asking for someone named Madison." 1 year later, autumn painted Tennessee in shades of gold and amber. David woke at 6 every morning. Not to conference calls or board meetings, but to the sound of small feet padding down the hallway and a voice calling, "Daddy, I'm hungry." The kitchen in their modest farmhouse was nothing like the penthouse he'd once owned. The countertops were laminate, not marble. The appliances were second-hand, not imported. The coffee maker had a crack in the carafe that he kept meaning to fix. He loved every inch of it. Madison appeared in the doorway, her hair a tangled mess, her pajamas decorated with purple bicycles. The scar on her chest was hidden beneath the fabric, a thin white line that would fade with time, but never fully disappear. "Pancakes?" David asked, "with chocolate chips. Is there any other kind?" She scrambled onto her stool at the kitchen island while David measured flour and cracked eggs. His technique had improved considerably over the past year. The first batch of pancakes he'd ever attempted had required the fire department. Now he could flip them one-handed. Jennifer emerged from the bedroom at 7, already dressed for work. She'd traded her waitress apron for an owner's smock navy blue with Madison's corner embroidered above the pocket. The bakery had opened 6 months ago, funded partly by David's remaining savings and partly by a small business loan she'd insisted on taking herself. She poured herself coffee and leaned against the counter, watching David slide a misshapen pancake onto Madison's plate. "That one looks like a duck," Madison observed. "It's abstract art," David replied. "It's a duck." Jennifer smiled into her mug. These moments still surprised her, the ordinariness of them, the ease. A year ago, she couldn't have imagined sharing a kitchen with David Harrison. Now she couldn't imagine mornings without him. They weren't married, hadn't even discussed it. Some wounds needed more than 12 months to heal. But they shared a home, shared a daughter, shared a life that was slowly stitching itself into something whole. David drove Madison to school in a 10-year-old pickup truck he'd bought from Robert's shop. The Bentley was long gone, sold along with most of his former life. He didn't miss it. At the school gates, Madison unbuckled her seatbelt and grabbed her backpack. Then she paused, turned, and wrapped her arms around David's neck. "Love you, Daddy." The words still made his chest ache. He wondered if they always would. "Love you too, sweetheart. Have a good day." He watched her run toward the building, her purple backpack bouncing with each step, until she disappeared through the front doors. The foundation he'd established, the Madison Harrison Children's Heart Fund, had helped 47 families in its first year. David spent 4 hours each day managing operations from a small office in town. The rest of his time belonged to his daughter. His left hand still trembled sometimes. Nerve damage from the surgery, minor but permanent, a small price. He'd pay it 1,000 times over. Sundays were reserved for family dinners at Robert's house. The old mechanic had softened over the past year. He still grumbled about David's inability to properly change oil, still criticized his wrench technique, still called him boy in moments of frustration, but he also saved David a seat at his table every Sunday, poured him whiskey from his private stash, and occasionally, very occasionally, clapped him on the shoulder with something approaching affection. Harrison Sr. attended when his health permitted. The old man had changed too, though the transformation was slower, harder, incomplete. He was learning to be a grandfather, one awkward interaction at a time. He brought Madison expensive gifts she didn't need and struggled through tea parties that clearly baffled him. But he showed up, week after week. He showed up. On this particular Sunday, Madison presented her latest artwork at the dinner table. Another family portrait, drawn in crayon on construction paper. 3 figures stood before a yellow house with a crooked chimney. A woman with brown hair, a small girl in a purple dress, and a man. This time, the man had a face, blue eyes, brown hair, a slightly lopsided smile that Madison had spent considerable effort perfecting. "That's us," she announced proudly. "Our family." Jennifer's eyes glistened. Robert suddenly became very interested in his mashed potatoes. Harrison Sr. excused himself to the bathroom, though everyone pretended not to notice the catch in his breath. David stared at the drawing for a long time. 4 years ago, Madison had drawn a faceless father, a placeholder for someone she'd never met. Now that empty space was filled with features she'd memorized through a year of bedtime stories, bicycle rides, burnt pancakes, and ordinary mornings. After dinner, David and Jennifer sat on Robert's porch, watching Madison chase fireflies in the yard. The September air carried hints of approaching autumn wood smoke and dry leaves, and the particular sweetness of things ending and beginning. David reached for his wallet from old habit. The photograph of Jennifer was still there. edges worn soft as cloth. But beside it now was a newer picture, the three of them standing in front of Madison's corner on opening day, covered in flour, laughing at something the camera hadn't captured. He didn't need the old photograph anymore. The woman in it was sitting right beside him, her hand warm in his. "I've been thinking," Jennifer said quietly. "About what? Second chances." She turned to look at him. "How sometimes they're exactly what we need. And sometimes—" She paused, watching Madison twirl through the grass, arms outstretched, fireflies blinking around her like earthbound stars. "Sometimes they're more than we ever deserved." David lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles. "Then let's try to deserve them." Madison ran toward the porch, fist raised triumphantly, a single firefly glowing between her fingers. "Look, I caught one." "Let's see," David said, leaning forward. Madison opened her palm. The firefly crawled across her skin, pulsing gold, then lifted off and drifted into the darkness. "Goodbye, little light," Madison whispered. She climbed onto the porch swing between her parents, nestling against Jennifer's side, her feet in David's lap. Within minutes, her breathing had deepened into sleep. The three of them swayed gently in the evening quiet. Robert appeared in the doorway, 2 beers in hand. He passed one to David without comment and settled into his rocking chair. "Nice night," the old man observed. "It is." David agreed. They sat in comfortable silence, 4 generations bound by something stronger than blood. Family. Some of us carry photographs, not just in our wallets, but in our hearts. Faded images of people we left behind. Moments we wish we could relive. Words we never said. David carried Jennifer's picture for 7 years. 7 years of silence. 7 years of regret. But when the moment came, he chose to stop running. He chose to stay. Maybe you know what that feels like. Maybe you have your own photograph, a face you think about late at night, a relationship you walked away from, a child or grandchild you wish you knew better. Maybe you have been the one waiting, like Jennifer, wondering if someone would ever come back. This story is about second chances, about learning that it is never too late to fix what we have broken, about discovering that family is not built from perfection, but from forgiveness, patience, and showing up even when it is hard. So here is my question for you. What photograph do you carry? Who would you call if you had one more chance? Share your story in the comments below. You never know whose heart you might touch or whose courage you might inspire to finally make that call. Because sometimes, the first step home is simply deciding to take it.